I remember the night my father died like it was yesterday. I was literally about to leave my apartment, go to work in the bar I was the deputy manager of, finishing off an episode of The Sopranos when my phone started to ring. For some reason, I got it into my head that it would be work calling, asking if I could come in earlier or some other nonsense reason. So, I took my time to answer, and when I did, it was incredibly nonchalantly. If I was pressed for a single emotion to sum up that moment, it was boredom, but a boredom that really wasn't to last. The news hit like a freight train. He had died suddenly, unexpectedly, of some kind of blood clot in his brain. One moment he was healthy and happy, the next, he was being announced dead on arrival. The funeral was rough. It sounds cruel to say, but I feel like if a relative is old, or has some kind of terminal illness, at least the family and friends have time to prepare, to ready themselves for the loss. But with us, we didn't have that time. It was like going 0 to 100 in seconds flat, bored to grief-stricken in the time it took to say, "I have some bad news." So instead of this kind of unwilling acceptance that have characterized the funerals I've been to in the past, there was just this shell-shocked sense of loss, like everyone had taken this 1-2 punch and were walking around in a daze, unable to quite process the loss they were feeling. I've never been big on visiting graves either. It sounds a bit callous, but what's the point? It's only ever to comfort the living. The dead don't know we do it, and quite frankly I would want someone to remember me, sure, but some ritual visitation that brings up all these feelings of mortality and impermanence? Nah, just raise a beer glass for me, that's all I want when I'm gone. But, when it came to my dad, I had next to no closure whatsoever. So I ended up going against my own previously held convictions, scrambling for that sense of attachment, desperate to feel like he wasn't really gone. Weekly visits became monthly visits, all with the same routine. I'd drink a can of his favorite lager over his grave, talk to him a wee bit about what's been going on in my life. It never made me really feel any better, but I could feel myself talking baby steps along the grief cycle each time I walked away. It was helping, in a small way, but it was still helping. And so the little ritual played itself out, in exactly the same way, until one day, when I saw an unfamiliar man standing near to where he was buried. He was dressed entirely in black, a long coat with a similarly dark umbrella under his arm. It wasn't clear if the man was visiting my father's gravesite, or simply one near to it, but as I walked closer and he caught sight of me, he quickly began to walk away from the gravestones and towards one of the cemetery's exits. Nothing unusual about that, right? People are entitled to grieve in privacy, I get that. So I didn't really think anything of it. That was until it happened all over again, in exactly the same way. I'd put it down to coincidence the second time around, but as a second time became a third time of seeing that same guy standing near the headstones, I started to think something weird was going on. That third time, I tried to approach out of sight, as quietly as possible. I wanted to figure out if he really was visiting my father's grave, not just one of those close to it. That's the time I realized he was. I watched from a distance as he knelt down near the headstone and touched it for a second. I didn't recognize him from the funeral, and although I couldn't exactly see his face, I knew for certain that he wasn't someone I knew, nor someone I'd met before, even in passing. My curiosity got the better of me, and I made up my mind to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. I kept my stealthy approach, staying light of foot and out of sight as I got closer and closer to the gravesite. But as I leveled with him, he turned, saw me, got this look of pure shock in his eyes, then actually started running in the opposite direction as me. I mean hurtling through the graves in the direction of an exit. I just sort of reacted and chased after him. It was that or faced the possibility of never getting another chance. After such a confrontational approach, he might never visit my father's grave again, and for the second time, I would be left in the dark, with no closure whatsoever. And there was not a single chance in hell that I was going to let that happen again. And so that's how I came to be chasing a guy through a goddamn cemetery, running full pelt, screaming at him to stop, how I just wanted to talk to him. The handful of other visitors looked on in a mix of shock and disgust, unable to quite believe how someone could be so disrespectful around the final resting places of so many of their loved ones. But if I'm honest, I really didn't care. I knew that if they were in my place, they'd be doing exactly the same thing. I caught up with the guy near one of the exists, actually managing to grab hold of him by the arm one point, pulling so that the guy was forced to spin around as a result of his own momentum. What I saw made me feel sick to my stomach. The face that I saw, barely covered by the black scarf anymore, was the face of my father. It was identical, in every way, only the way he carried himself, minor perceptions of body language and stature, was much different than I remembered. When he spoke, it sent my head swimming. My father was from the south of England, and his accent reflected that, but this guy had a distinctly Scottish accent, at least that's what it sounded like. It definitely wasn't my dad's accent. He told me to leave him alone before he took off again, and God help me, I did. My legs were jelly, and not just from the burst of sprinting that my decidedly unathletic self had seemed to conjure up. I couldn't move, I just couldn't bring myself to follow him. After a sit-down discussion with my mom, the only thing we can agree upon is that the man must have been my father's identical twin. She had seen his body after all, she had identified him at the morgue. There was no way he had faked his own death, or any of the other overly paranoid things I initially suggested. But as my mom asserted, he had never, ever mentioned having a brother, let alone a twin. It's something we're obviously going to look into, as if this guy is who we think he is, some long-lost sibling of my dad's, then I'd really like to get in touch with him. Right after I dropped out of high school and moved out of my parents' house, I needed work real bad. I'd have done pretty much anything for rent money about that time in my life, so I'm lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, that the local cemetery needed employees. At first, the old-timers who'd been working there for 20 or 30 years just wondered why someone so young would ever want to be a gravedigger. It was tough work, hell on the lower back, but I soon adjusted, and it turned out to be something more akin to a free gym membership than an actual job. I mean it, I got swole pretty goddamn fast. If I'm honest, it only ever felt like work if the weather was bad or we had an actual funeral on site. Otherwise, it was just nice to be able to spend time outdoors. So, the way our cemetery was set up was pretty simple. The majority of the grounds were just regular grave sites, pretty much the same size and same price. But the northwest corner of the grounds was a private site that contained much larger plots. These were reserved for much wealthier families, and the local undertaker made a lot of cash from selling extravagant grave setups to them. I'm talking whole mausoleums, statues of angels, stuff like that. We hardly ever visited that area of the site, except for cleaning and maintenance duties, and those were never left to me. I didn't take it personally, but the older guys just didn't trust me with all the cleaning chemicals and whatnot that kept the marble and brass fixtures looking fresh. Which is why it was so weird when I got a phone call one of my days off, asking me if I'd been up to that area recently. My boss was pissed, I could hear it in his voice, and he pulled no punches when he asked me if I'd been screwing around in the northwest plots. Of course I told him no, that the last time I'd been up there was to watch one of the old-timers using the marble cleaning chemical as part of my training. And that had been months back. He sighed, seemed confused and confounded, so I asked him what exactly the issue was. He replied that it could wait until the next time I was at work. I was worried, sure, but I was pretty sure that I hadn't done anything wrong, not deliberately anyway, and especially nothing that involved the northwest plots. A couple of days later, when I rolled into work, the atmosphere was tense as hell. I knew something fairly serious had happened, all I knew I wouldn't have to badger anyone to find out why. The boss man walked me out to the northwest plot, silent the whole way, and I knew better than to open my mouth until I found out exactly what was going on. There was already a worker up in the plot, tending to one of the graves. That's when my boss told me that if I'd been hanging around the area, maybe during my lunch break, eating a few snacks among the opulent gravesites, now would be the time to tell him. I swore to God that I hadn't, that I knew better than to eat stuff near the graves as I'd been well informed, it attracts wild animals that can in turn, do damage to some of the resting places. That's when he broke it down for me. Something had tried to dig up one of the freshly dug graves out in the northwest plots. He said something in particular and not someone because we each had enough experience to recognize when a grave had been dug with tools or by hand, or in this case, by claw. It was rough around the edges, obvious claw marks in the dirt as opposed to the straight lines carved out by a shovel. This was something of an emergency, I mean, for obvious sanitary reasons, but for sentimental reasons too. If local families discovered that wild animals were trying to dig up their deceased relatives, there would be an uproar. Something had to be done, and quickly. A meeting was called among the grave diggers and attendants. As far as we knew, the mysterious digging had taken place overnight, and was mostly likely undertaken by some kind of scavenger animal, a coyote, a black bear, maybe even an escaped dog. The solution was obvious. Night watchmen would have to be present in the cemetery, every night, until the situation was resolved. And guess who was voluntold to be the night watchman for the first full week? You guessed it. The young guy, the new guy, me. The only thing that made the proposal even vaguely attractive was the fact that anyone doing the night work would be paid double the regular rate, and I could definitely have done with the extra cash. First night of being on watch really sucked. All I had for company was a flask of strong coffee and a .22 pellet gun loaned to me by one of the other workers to take down any varmints. It was long, boring and lonely, but once I adjusted my sleeping pattern, it got a little easier. Then, on the second to last night of my watchman duties, I was on a little foot patrol, walking up towards the northwest plot with a flashlight in my hand. That's when I saw it, a flurry of frantic limbs, digging at the earth. I could have shouted something, maybe even fired the .22 in the air to scare the animal away, but something in me wanted to end this whole thing right then and there. If I killed whatever critter was causing us so much trouble, I might be out of the extra pay, but at least I'd have my daytime life back. I crept up slowly, turning the flashlight off and sneaking stealthily towards the dark shape working away at the earth. I've hunted rabbits at night with my uncle before, so I figured I'd use the old flashlight technique to cause the animal to freeze for a second so I could take the killing shot. But when I aimed that powerful flashlight in the direction of the digging thing, I almost cried out in fear. It wasn't an animal at all, it was a human, crouched on all fours, digging away at the earth with his or her bare hands. I couldn't bring myself to aim the rifle, I was too shocked at what I was looking at. So all I did was start making as much noise as possible, telling them to get out of there, saying I'd call the cops if they didn't comply. They complied all right, but not out of fear. The look in that person's eyes was one of fury, pure anger that they'd been interrupted in their obscene little act. I swear, if I hadn't had that rifle with me, if I hadn't the means to defend myself that were obvious to them, I honestly don't know if I'd be here today to tell his story. Needless to say, the other workers didn't believe what I'd saw. Some of them told me they didn't doubt that I'd seen something, they just disputed what that thing was. And I get that, I really do, but still, I know what I saw. And it was definitely a person. I see there's been a call for creepy or unexplainable stories centering on cemeteries. Well, I most definitely have something to offer in that regard. You see, I am from Hong Kong and I work at Pak Fu Lam Cemetery, one of the most overcrowded burial grounds in the entire world. Constructed in 1882, the private Pak Fu Lam Cemetery on the western side of Hong Kong Island is an absolutely magnificent sight. Even having lived here all my life, its grandiosity is something that has never grown mundane for me. Built into the mountainside in terraced steps and interconnected with staircases, the cemetery resembles a giant outdoor amphitheater. My story starts just before the festival we call Qingming. Also known as Tomb Sweeping Day, the festival in early April dates back 2,000 years to the Han Dynasty. On this day, families will visit their deceased relatives' grave sites to clean them. This is mainly a show of respect to our ancestors, to show how we keep them in our thoughts and prayers. But it is also a status thing, as a family with clean and well-tended graves is the most worthy of prestige. And due to the extreme overcrowding at the cemetery, where some families can pay over $30,000 for the privilege of being buried there, some years we have to do a fair amount of work before the family visits commence. And sometimes, this work is not pretty. So, last April, I was given the job of moving some remains into newer grave sites to make room for those who had paid vast sums of money for the most attractive burial sites. It's something I'd never done before, and quite frankly I was dreading it. Cultural taboos of moving a person's remains aside, it was apparently some of the hardest, most grueling work me or my colleagues would ever have to do. Wrapped up in layers of protective equipment on some of the most humid days of the year, those charged with the task had to be meticulous to be able to move remains up and down hundreds of sets of stairs without losing so much as a speck of dust or bone. And so it came to be, that one very early morning, I put on my mask, goggles and forensic suit. We have a name for this in Cantonese, but this is the most accurate translation, and set about beginning my task. I worked 8 hours straight on just breaking the grave seal. Since we have to move the entire grave, along with the remains, every piece has to stay intact and undamaged. This was a very old and unkempt grave too, one which the family of the deceased had happily accepted money from a wealthier family for. With the cash injection resulting from this, they could afford to spruce the gravesite up a little, or maybe even keep the money for themselves. But that was unlikely. I could not even read the name on the headstone. It had been worn away by the elements over the years, so I was hoping the family would invest in making the grave look a little more presentable. The next day came the time to actually start bagging up the remains. It was a painstaking process, collecting every individual bone after breaking through the rotten wooden coffin that housed the body. I came to realize that it's also a very hard task because you're faced with your own mortality. Yes, being around a cemetery all day, 5 days a week, makes you reflect on death. But our jobs are consumed with the banalities of maintenance and cleaning tasks, and so it is easy to distract oneself with smaller jobs so that the overall theme of death slips quietly into the background. But it is not possible to compartmentalize so effectively when faced with another human's corpse. Picking through this long dead person's bones was horrific. Singling out each little piece of them, placing the pieces into the relevant plastic bag, it was seeing a human being in their most basic pieces. Like a broken down Lego set that would be impossible to reconstruct. It made me think of how fragile we are, how temporary and fleeting our lives are. Parts of us do stick around, longer after we're dead, just not the pieces we want. Now, I feel I need to preface this by saying that I do not believe in the supernatural or the paranormal. I know there is a perfectly rational explanation for what happened to me during this time, but it's an explanation that has thus far escaped me. You see, on the nights after I began performing these tasks, I began to have the strangest dreams. Ones in which I would be working in the cemetery, only to be approached by a young woman who was apparently visiting her ancestors' graves. She was very beautiful, tall for a girl in Hong Kong, and chose to dress in a very traditional Chinese style instead of the Western dress that seems to be much more popular here, especially among younger people such as myself. It was a very lucid dream, so lucid that when I awoke, I had the woman's name on my lips. Her name was Li Yan-K, and all the next day I couldn't stop thinking about the dream I had about her. The dreams persisted for a few nights, departing and returning as the week dragged on, and I didn't really think anything of it until the time came to restore the engraving and the painting on the tombstone itself. We had to consult old handwritten databases to discover the name of the person interred in that particular plot. These were huge, thick tomes retrieved from the back of some dusty vault somewhere, and if it wasn't for the meticulous organization of these records, our job would have taken much, much longer to complete. Only when I came to the records of the remains I had been excavating, I thought I must have made some kind of mistake. The family names Li, then the middle name Yan were the first words I read. I immediately thought of the recurring dream I'd been having, the one with the pretty girl saying hello as she visited her deceased relatives. I dreaded seeing the next word, desperately hoping it wouldn't be K, and I thanked God that it wasn't. It was Fan, the deceased person I had been moving was named Li Yan Fan. But that wasn't enough to calm me down. It was still far too much of a coincidence that the family name and middle name of this dream girl and the dead person were exactly the same. The dream started to abate once the remains had been moved and the grave sealed up again. There were no more nightly visits from Li Yan-K. I still can't quite explain why I had those dreams, but I'm almost certain that it was just my way of processing the stressful, painstaking process of moving a once living person's remains. But even when I try to rationalize what happened, I never fail to be intensely creeped out and uncomfortable.